Anyways, we are going to get started here. I do want to just, because this is a federal overview, this is obviously an issue that we constantly are fixated on, recognizing that the federal government has a fundamental enabling legislation approach to the cannabis industry in this country, and there has been the perspective that safety and ensuring security of supply is one of the overarching themes, and as such, Health Canada was the mandated department to ensure that there was a very tight control and regulation about how the legalization would unroll and be implemented throughout the country. We have some gentlemen here today that will speak about the perspective from their departments, and again, we will be talking about the legalization branch, the licensing aspect of this. Todd Cain will give the overview of that. Mohan Denetto from Indigenous Services Canada, who has been one of the individuals to help ensure that this conference was provided some funding to get people here that maybe couldn't afford to get here. We had the support of Indigenous Services Canada, and given that Indigenous Services involved, the specific aspect that Mohan will speak about is the business development side of this, and what sort of opportunities are there in working directly with Indigenous Services, and how we could actually come together to bridge our ideas and to actually look at the potential policy gaps and how resourcing and capacity are there to support the industry. Mohan has been very helpful in helping that dialogue and providing ways and alternatives to maybe getting us moving a little quicker towards the finish line. And again, Gerald Goslin will speak about ESDC Canada and basically the importance of looking at the capacity in our communities. And I think we will find over the next while, as we start to see more and more of our people participate in the industry at the community level, that we do have expertise. Grant is delayed, so I am moderating. So thank you, Brian. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hand it to our panelists, and perhaps we can just do a bit of an overview, and then we'll start to dialogue. And basically, I think some of these overarching questions is, if we're just starting out as a First Nation, what are some of the things that we need to do from the perspective of licensing, and how do we get ourselves engaged, and what if we are wanting to get involved in the medicinal side versus the recreational side? I think we'll see some of these things come out of these initial summary discussions, and then we can further dialogue. So again, we'll turn it over to Todd Cain from the Health Canada. Miigwech.
Thank you. All right, okay, sounds good, and we're just waiting for a couple of slides to come up behind me here. What I had hoped to do in opening remarks before handing it over to Mohan and Gerard is to talk a little bit about the aspects of the new cannabis sector that require a Health Canada license, and go into a little bit of detail about what that looks like, what the process is like, and then I'll hand it off to Mohan. He'll talk more broadly about the economic development opportunities in the sector beyond the things that require licensing. So that's kind of how we've set up the front end of the panel, and then we'll go where you want to go in terms of the Q&A session. So as the slide suggests, I was going to do a bit more of a detailed walkthrough on the process to become a license holder. Before we get into the specifics, though, many of you may have heard some of these high-level points about the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regulations before, but it really is important for us to continuously come back to the key legal framework that has been put in place as of last October and the principles that underline it. So it really is fundamentally a public health approach to legalization and strict regulation. And when we say strict, we're not just using that for public relations purposes. The regime is quite tight, and that's for all kinds of good public health reasons. A lot of lessons learned from the tobacco world that have informed our approach to the legalization of cannabis. As part of that framework, there are licenses required for a number of different activities that you might want to do with cannabis, and that's what we'll get into as we go along. Most of those activities require a federal license, as I'm sure most of you are aware. If you're looking at the retail side, that piece is actually regulated by our provincial colleagues. Where we stand today, I think we're, when we put this slide into the conference organizers, we were at 150 licenses for cannabis, either cultivation, processing, or medical sales. We've issued a couple more late last week, so we're now up to the kind of 152, 153 level. And the types of licenses that we provide under the cannabis regulations are outlined at the bottom of this slide. And I'll just go through each of those so you get a sense of what your business model is and what license that might align to if you're contemplating applying to us to get a license. So cultivation is the kind of thing that most people think of when they think of cannabis, the classic grow-op, which looks a lot different in the legal world than it might have in the days of yore in the illegal market. But what we've tried to do with the cannabis regulations is recognize that people might want to grow at a whole variety of different sizes and scales. So we've had the medical system for 5-6 years now, and under that system, most people who came into us to apply to cultivate cannabis for the medical needs were generally sort of mid-sized to very large businesses. So a typical application under the old regulations would have been sort of 25, 50,000 square feet, and you've all seen the headlines of some of the mega facilities that are out there where they're up into the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square feet, some of them even at the 1 million square foot mark. So we have a license that we call standard cultivation, which is meant to cover sort of the mid to large to jumbo size cultivators, and that is probably still our most popular license type, is for standard cultivation. But we've also created a new stream here called micro cultivation, and that's really defined by one specific thing, which is the most square footage that you can have under a micro cultivation license is 2,150 square feet. That's 200 square meters. And what it's meant to be is for people who may have been growing in the past, who want to kind of come over and join the legal market, those who want to get into something that looks more like a microbrewery. This license has been designed to accommodate people who want to do that. And the regulatory requirements for microcultivation are a little bit lighter in some of the areas of physical security, because there's less product on site, there's less risk of someone trying to break in and steal, because there's just less there to get. So the process has been set up to be a little bit lighter to proportion the regulatory oversight to the risk involved in microcultivation. And we've set up a specific team to deal with microcultivation, and as I get into it, microprocessing licenses. So if you're thinking you want to get into this at a modest scale, microcultivation would be a really good place for you to get started in the sector. As you move downstream, though, if you move from cultivation and you actually want to get into producing products with cannabis, then you need a processing license. And again, we've set those up at two scales. A standard cultivation or standard processing license is the bulk of what we've seen so far. But we have had a couple people now come in for a microprocessing license. And the microprocessing license, like the microcultivation license, is essentially limited just in the amount of cannabis that you can kind of either grow yourself under your cultivation license and move into your processing operation, or if you just want to have a standalone processing business, you can buy a certain amount of cannabis under a micro, process that into dried cannabis, cannabis oil, and then the more creative products that are coming along with the next phase of the regulations. But you're limited essentially in the amount of cannabis that you can handle in a given year. So processors are the people who are taking the dried cannabis, they're taking that and they're transforming it into the final products. So they're the group that has to be familiar with all the packaging, labeling. A lot of the good production practices really kick in when you get into the processing side of the business. And so that's a little bit more knowledge intensive, a little bit more capital intensive, particularly as you look at the production of extracts and some of the edible products that'll come along with phase 2. You're going to need to have the specialized equipment to be able to produce those things in a way that is sort of clean and safe and predictable. Another new license type that we introduced back in mid-October was nursery. And the whole idea behind the nursery license is if you've got that green thumb, if you're really into plant genetics, into creating or integrating strains, the nursery license is the one to look at. It allows you to create baby plants, create seeds, and sell those to people who are working elsewhere in the cannabis sector. So it's really designed for those people who are all about the genetics. So those are the ones that we call the cannabis class licenses, so processing, nursery, cultivation, and then, sorry, I missed the one at the bottom, sale for medical purposes. So with the creation of the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regs, if you want to sell into what many of us refer to as the adult use or the non-medical, the recreational market, you sell off of your processing license into the provinces and territories. But if you want to sell directly to patients, which is the system that we've had in place for 4, 5, 6 years, that's still an option. You're able to register patients, sell to them directly through mail order or internet type models. That requires a sale for medical purposes license. So you can have that as a standalone license where you buy from others, warehouse the product, and then ship it out to people who choose to register with you. Or you could have a fully integrated business where you grow it, you turn it into products, and you sell it into the medical stream all yourself. So I guess the point I'm trying to make more broadly is you have a lot of options to kind of pick a business model and then pick the licenses that are going to be required to kind of line up to that business model. If you don't really want to do commercial activities directly with cannabis, we have a couple other licenses that are also available. So analytical testing. Today we're sitting at about 60-ish labs across the country who have an analytical testing lab to do work on cannabis. So they are testing for all the different quality tests that we require. They're testing for the presence of pesticides. In some cases, they're doing other testing that's more of a commercial interest, isn't a regulatory requirement, but the licensed producers like to kind of know what's in their product and how different growing conditions produce different results. So there's 50 of those labs across the country. That is a fairly straightforward process to become certified or licensed as an analytical testing lab to handle cannabis. Research is another new license class. So under the old rules, we had a couple of different ways that people could conduct research with cannabis. That's been simplified into a single, fairly light licensing process for you to get licensed to do research. And we're seeing research take place now on a fairly broad scale across the country. The other one that I'll touch on later in my slides, it's not on this summary slide at the front though, is hemp. So as the name of this conference would suggest, industrial hemp is now licensed under the Cannabis Act. We've refreshed those regulations, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that process is like when I get to that slide. So under this public health approach, the licensing requirements, in many ways, they carried forward from the medical regime into the adult use non-medical market. And if you want to get into one of those license types where you're producing cannabis, either through cultivation or through the transformation of cannabis into products, you need to come into us for a license, and those license requirements are listed here on the slide. And I'll just go through each of those so you get a sense of what it is you're looking as you contemplate a license from Health Canada to get into the cannabis world. So physical security is pretty obvious. If you're into one of those standard class licenses, you are looking at a multi-ring level of security so that you've got perimeter control, you have room control in the areas where cannabis is present, and then you've got an even higher level of security where you store the finished product, which obviously is the most high value added, the thing that would be most likely to be the subject of an attempted theft. So physical security is a big aspect of your application, a big aspect of the investment that you would make, and a big aspect of what we review when we look at your applications when they come in the door. Good production practices, those of you who might have come from the pharmaceutical world or from the food production world, all of those regulated systems have some kind of a model in place to make sure that what gets produced has met certain standards every time so that the consumer can consume with confidence that certain testing standards have been met, certain production practices have been in place. So in the cannabis world, we call that good production practices. And it gets at things like sanitation, testing protocols, those sorts of things. So you need to have those established as you develop your license application. And then the other big aspect of our quality control system is the person that you choose to put in control of quality assurance. So we have specific requirements around what an individual needs to have by way of qualifications to be your quality assurance person, because they really are the linchpin of whether your good production practices are going to work in practice or whether they're just sort of something that's been jotted down on paper. Personnel security is the third big aspect of what we do. The regulations have a number of specific requirements for the people who are really in positions of control in your cannabis enterprise. They need to come into us and go through a fairly in-depth security clearance process. We work with the RCMP, who in turn works with police of local jurisdiction to see if there's any risks from your background or from the background of someone who might be on your board of directors or in one of your key leadership positions, that they may not be in someone we want in a position of trust within the cannabis enterprise that you've applied to open up. Some of the other requirements on the bottom part of that list I won't spend quite as much time on, but you obviously need to demonstrate how you're going to comply with packaging, labeling, and shipping. Record keeping, we're a regulator. It sounds like pretty mundane stuff, but record keeping is actually a really critical aspect of how we get the assurance that you're operating in line with all of the regulatory requirements. And so the way you set up your record keeping system right from the beginning is a pretty important aspect of your application. Notifications to local authorities. This is a particular issue in Indigenous communities where sometimes we've got overlapping jurisdictions, so we've been working to try and make sure that all of the requirements are clear, that if you're operating within traditional territories, that notifications go to the First Nation or the other Indigenous authority in the area, as well as a provincially mandated municipality. New requirement we have now is something called the Organizational Security Plan, and that's sort of your big picture view of how you're going to control security on top of the physical security requirements that are there. And then we look at your site location and kind of who your controlling investors are. So it's a pretty comprehensive package that we look for. A number of those requirements are a little bit lighter if you're coming in for the nursery or micro type licenses. And then for research and analytical labs, a lot of that stuff actually doesn't apply. So it's a much lighter licensing process there. We have a system now that we call the Cannabis Tracking and Licensing System. So we used to get all of this information in hard copy, and people would send us in, you know, 1 inch to 3 inches of material. That's now collected through this online portal. You still have to do the same level of diligence, but you're doing that through an online system. It's great for record keeping. It makes it easier for us to see what you've submitted, and then you can start to see your application as it progresses through our review process. Communications back and forth. So in your initial application, I'll talk about this on the next slide, which is more of a process view, but we do try and communicate back and forth with our applicants. There are periods where you won't hear from us because we're kind of working on other files, but when we're actively reviewing your file, we're in touch pretty regularly. So flowchart of a typical license application review process. This may be hard to see from the back, but let me just kind of walk you through it. When you first come into us, the first thing you're going to want to do is apply for an ID to use this cannabis tracking and licensing system. So CTLS is our favorite new acronym. And that's the system that you would use to start to create your application, identify who your people are, you know, identify your corporation that you've set up to make this application with. Once you've got that ID, then you can start to build out your application, add other details in as you go. Once you're ready to hit submit, then we get notified that you are in the queue for screening, and that's the first substantive step. Is you've submitted your application and we're giving it an initial look. So the green bar there, intake and initial screening. What we do at that point is we do a quick look to make sure all of the key components are there and that you've provided enough detail that when it actually goes to one of our reviewers, that they have enough that they can actually do their work on the substance of your application. So it's not a check mark that your application is green lighted and ready to go. It just means your application is complete and it's ready to move into the queue for review. And then we dual stream it. So we have one team that looks at the physical security, the good production practices, and then we have another team that looks at the personnel security. So that's what you see in the 2A and 2B, the purple and the blue. So those happen generally in parallel. Security, as soon as we have room available with the RCMP, we'll put the security clearances over to them, and then as soon as we have a reviewer available, we'll pick up your file and start the more substantive review. So often at the end of that substantive review, we'll come back to the applicant and we'll say, all right, is your facility actually built? The majority of applications that come into us today actually are, they may have a building, they may have a lease on a building, but they haven't actually done all of the conversion of that facility to meet the regulatory requirements. They've done it on paper, they've shown their security model, they've got the blueprints of how they're going to do it, and then they'll come to us and say, can you take a look? And we do that. And then we'll come back to them and they'll say, all right, thank you very much. We're actually going to go do the construction, and then we'll put the file on hold until they come back to us and say, we're built out, here's all the pictures, here's a video walkthrough of the facility, and that's where we'll get to the point where we're ready to issue an initial license. So the facility has to be fully built out. You need to show us that what you did on paper has actually been done on the ground at your location. So then we're into a system now where we call it graduated licensing. What that means is when you first get a license from us, you'll be able to cultivate cannabis, you'll be able to start to process cannabis, but you won't be able to sell it, or only under very limited terms. Because generally speaking, we would not have done an inspection of your facility yet. So it allows you to get under business, it allows you to kind of acquire your starting materials, get some inventory built up, actually operate your quality control system. And at some point you come back to us and you say, okay, we'd like to be able to start to sell to the provinces and territories, we'd like to be able to sell into the medical market, and at that point we'll generally send an inspector out to see on the ground if everything is operating according to your plan. And at that point we would modify your license and give you the authority to sell. So that's it. We call the system progressive licensing. You can kind of see how you build up authorities over time as you demonstrate compliance with the regs, either through the application process or through an on-site inspection. The Indigenous Navigator Service is something that we set up about a year ago, and just a couple of words on that. We have a small team that supports applicants who identify as Indigenous through the application process. And Roxy is actually here at our booth today, so if you want to say hello, please do that. She'd love to chat with you. And she has a small team that helps her with her work. The focus of the Indigenous Navigator Service is really around the kind of information that I just helped to provide, but in a lot more detail. So it helps people understand the process steps, where they're at in it, what they need to do next, and how to navigate their way through what, for many people, is not the most obvious way to get licensed to do something like grow or process cannabis. And it's kind of a recognition, it's a way to try and help to level the playing field for those who may not be familiar with operating in a highly regulated environment. So it's trying to bring applicants' knowledge up to that level. The Navigator, for those who have identified as an Indigenous affiliated applicant, is a way, it's another point of contact. It can be actually your sole point of contact if you choose to use it that way as you work your way through the licensing process. They'll really serve as a facilitator and a coordinator to help you as you get to those key milestones in the application process. Industrial hemp, I mentioned on my intro slide back a couple of minutes ago. So just to be really clear on what industrial hemp is, we have had industrial hemp regulations for a good 10, 15 years in Canada, and we have actually quite a strong, well-developed industrial hemp sector. And the plant, if you talk to a botanist or someone who actually knows a lot more about plant genetics than I do, cannabis is cannabis. Industrial hemp, as we've defined it in law, is a cannabis plant that has less than 0.3% THC in the flowering heads and leaves. So it's really defined by what it isn't, which is a high THC or even a modest THC producing variant of the cannabis plant. So when we put the Cannabis Act in place, we updated the industrial hemp regulations. They carry forward a lot of the old rules that have been in place for some time and have served the hemp sector pretty well. But the really significant change is that under the new industrial hemp regulations, you are actually able to harvest parts of the plant that you used to have to destroy. So those parts of the plant principally are the flowering head and the leaves, which is where generally you would find cannabinoids. So if you've got an industrial hemp plant that has the 0.3 or less THC, but has a high percentage of cannabidiol, CBD, you're able to harvest those parts of the plant, sell them to a cannabis processor, or obtain a cannabis processing license yourself, and then have cannabis extract available for use in other cannabis products. So it really unlocks a lot more of the value of the hemp plant if it is a high CBD variant of hemp. And so this has been kind of welcomed by those traditional hemp growers. It gives them a new potential stream of revenue. We made a whole bunch of kind of special amendments to the licensing process last summer and over the fall. But for people who come in for this growing season, they'll automatically have the ability to sell these additional plant parts into the cannabis processing market. Just a couple of words on research and analytical testing, and then I'm going to hand it over to Mohan. Research with cannabis does require an authority from Health Canada. So if you're handling the product, whether that is like how to grow cannabis at a higher yield per square foot, whether that is clinical trials where you're trying out cannabis in a medical context, doesn't matter. If you're handling the product, you need to come in for a research license. Most people come into us for a specific project, so maybe it's a university or maybe it's a lab and they just want to do a 6-month piece of work, and they'll come in, they'll get that license from us and we'll send it out. But other organizations come into us and they actually want to be permanently established to do cannabis research. So we have a couple of universities and research institutes where that's what they're doing. So there's a lot of variety in what we see in the research world. As I said a little while ago, the requirements generally are a lot lighter. You do need to have a kind of a lab manager who is qualified to operate a lab. That's really the critical piece. And if you do plan on having a fairly high volume of cannabis, we may ask you to have some basic security features in place. But generally, most research, they're dealing with a very modest amount of cannabis, and so the requirements are consequently pretty modest as well. And I think I spent enough time on analytical testing when I went through the earlier intro slide. There you really need to have a laboratory manager, again, who's able to demonstrate compliance with laboratory practices, some basic security provisions, and just a good sense of how you're going to manage the samples that come in, the destruction of those after the time period has expired. So we're seeing a lot of interest in cannabis testing because the much larger cannabis market is creating demand for testing services, so it's a good area to explore. With that, I'm going to kind of finish where I wanted to cover off in terms of licensing. I think the key takeaway, though, is as you contemplate what you might want to do in the cannabis sector, I've laid out what things we have licenses for. So if you're contemplating activities that might require a license, then you'll want to come and see Health Canada. But by all accounts, the overall economic value that the cannabis sector is going to create, slightly less than half of it is actually going to be for the cannabis producers, processors. The rest is going to be in the secondary cannabis market for things like shipping, receiving, testing, packaging, marketing, all the ancillary services. So I think Mohan's going to talk a little more broadly about the economic opportunity that cannabis presents.
Thank you, Todd.
All right. Is the microphone on? All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to present, and thanks to the Algonquin people for welcoming us here. Just want to tell you a bit about the business support context, because Todd did a really good job of explaining kind of the licensing process and the avenues of opportunity. But of course, it's a complicated business in some respects. There's many opportunities, a broad spectrum of opportunities. I think as people wanting to get into this business, as business owners or community members who may have ECDEV corps that are interested in this business, it would be important strategically to determine what your opportunity is and what path you want to pursue. So we wanted to structure this panel a little bit around giving you some of the context of the licensing, and then also what are the supports available to help individual businesses, individual entrepreneurs, and communities get into this business. So that's the intent of this presentation, and my colleague here is going to get into some of the training and development opportunities as well. Okay, so I just went over that. So definitely, lots of opportunity. I think we heard that and we all recognize that, and that's why we're here. The projections that Canadians may spend as much as $4.3 billion on legal recreational cannabis products in 2019. So that gives you a sense of the opportunity. Again, the medical market is still there, so that's important to recognize, and there are opportunities there as well. And of course, building on the Tsutina Conference, clearly there's an interest and a desire to be involved and to take advantage of this opportunity. And from our perspective, I think this is a big part of reconciliation as well. The Prime Minister in the recent speech he gave at the AFN Assembly talked about economic reconciliation. And so we recognize some of the messages we heard at the Tsutina Conference about wanting to take advantage of these opportunities as the market builds. And so want to reaffirm that we do have supports, and we're here to support you, including supporting this gathering in part. So I won't go over this because I think some of it was covered in Todd's presentation, but kind of you can build the streams of opportunity into the three big groups of cultivation and processing, and there's some subsets of different lanes in that. Of course, the retail opportunities, currently under the current system, regulated or delegated to the provinces and territories, and the ancillary as well. So the services around the industry, I think, are important to recognize as well. And depending on the scope and scale of your ambitions or where you want to get into the market, I think it's also important to look at all three potential streams in that area. So departmental programming, I think we had a good sense of the context for business support. So the Cannabis Act does allow a certain structure for business to happen, essentially. The government, the business development programs that we oversee and manage in partnership with a number of Indigenous partners, supporting participation of Indigenous business in the legal cannabis industry through specific assistance, which I'll get into in further slides. And the department, I should emphasize, has programs to support both communities and entrepreneurs. All right, so there's a bit of a distinction in kind of how the programming is deployed, and I'll get into that as well. And one avenue is through Indigenous Services Canada. The other avenue is through the Aboriginal Financial Institutions Network, and many of you are familiar with the AFIs. And there's probably some representatives here in the room today with us. So first off, in anticipation of legalization of cannabis, we modernized our terms and conditions of our program to recognize legalization and include cannabis and hemp as an eligible activity. So that was an important step in kind of synchronizing our programs with the fact that cannabis would be legalized soon. The CORP program, the Community Opportunities Readiness Program, provides project-based funding to First Nation and certain Inuit communities, depending on where they're located in the country. And there's other programs for the Northern Territories Inuit for a range of activities to support a community's pursuit of economic opportunity. So what I should emphasize here is this program is for community-owned businesses. So the eligibility under the CORP program is not for individual entrepreneurs. It's for community-owned businesses that are owned by a First Nation or Inuit community that's recognized by the department. And proposals are assessed based on their ability to do a few things. One is, of course, the sound business model. So our team will look at the business plan and make sure that all the ratios and numbers make sense in terms of a viable business. And we have experts that can help you do that. We have 7 regional offices, and that's usually the point of entry for community-led proposals, is our regional offices across the country. And they will do an initial assessment and help the community build the business plan. And there's funding to actually help build the business plan before you get to the point of submitting a business plan. And we also look for leveraging, and I think that's important to note. In general, what you'll find is, we have a certain budget envelope for about 700 plus communities across the country. It is limited. The projects are ranked nationally in a competitive process. And so the support the government provides is probably just one piece of the puzzle. And so we have a lot of presentations today and tomorrow about the various partnership elements that probably will be necessary to get a business up and running, including the private sector. The banks are often involved, private investors, the provinces and territories have funding, the regional development, economic development agencies, also federal, that are in each region, like Western Diversification, SEDQ in Quebec, ACOA in Atlantic, for example, CanNor in the north. They also have funding. So I would say this is one input that's under Indigenous services, but really to be successful, I think you need to look at the full spectrum of inputs that you may have available to you. So proposals are assessed by our teams in the region. Anything under 250,000 is, the decision is made in the region. For any proposals over 250,000, the proposal comes to Ottawa for assessment. So that's generally how we operate. And to note, 7 proposals to support community-owned cannabis businesses have been received under the program so far. So there is an interest that's building. Of course, this program provides support to all businesses in construction, hotels, casinos, gas stations, retail. So as you can imagine, it's a fairly competitive program. So the themes under this program eligible for support, again, community-owned businesses. So costs related to identifying economic opportunities. So basically market studies, developing the business plan, some of the initial funding can be provided to get you to the stage of a full-blown business proposal. We do go right up to economic infrastructure, so bricks and mortar can be provided. Usually on that, the funding is limited, so we do look for leveraging, more leveraging of other sources, including own source revenue of the community. We do provide funding for an equity gap, so if it's a straight equity purchase of assets or into a business, we will consider that. Again, we're looking for partnership and other partners in that. And business planning and advisory services to help develop the business and help grow it. And there you have the link for more details on those guidelines. And as I said, the point of entry into the program is the regional office that we have across the country, and you can get that information on the website as well. So for entrepreneurs and businesses, so these are non-community-based businesses. The individuals may be members of community, but the business may not necessarily be backed or owned by the community. So we're exploring ways that existing program could support greater participation of individuals. We have the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, and as I said, that is a program that's been devolved to the Aboriginal financial institutions. So they provide non-repayable contributions, developmental lending, and business support services to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit businesses. So I don't know, I'll just ask, are there any AFIs in the room? Just to put up your hand. Hopefully there may be a few in here. I think I saw some people on the, oh, there we go. So there are some people from the AFIs. I'm not, as I said, that program is devolved. We still fund it and support it, but really they're the lead on how to apply, how to get funding, the program criteria. So I don't really want to go into that because that's not my place. So hopefully there's an opportunity, maybe some of them have booths around that can provide some information on that. So that is for individuals, not community-owned businesses. So in conclusion, definitely there are a number of federal departments. I've given you a sense of what Indigenous Services Canada can provide and an indication of the Aboriginal financial institutions. There's other supports out there. I don't know when this is going to be launched, but I just saw a mock-up of a website, a tool that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada is creating that'll really kind of give you a sense of you go to a website, you punch in a keyword, I'm interested in shipbuilding, and it'll list all the government programs that are available. So once that is launched, I can commit to distribute it to the conference organizers. I think that'll be a great tool to just give you a sense of what's out there. I think there are a lot of supports available, even at the federal level, but as well, even at the provincial and municipal level to help you get into the business. I mentioned the federal regional economic development agencies that are on the ICED website. That's also a source of funding. And of course, the private sector and joint venture partners. And there is a panel session this afternoon that I think would be very interesting in terms of how to joint venture and how to partner. And licensed producers, of course, may be eligible to apply to all of these programs. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague to talk about ESDC's supports that may be offered.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me here. I'd like to thanks for the great welcome to the Algonquin unceded territory here. It's always a great opportunity to present. Over the last 10 months, we've gone through a very busy time at ESDC, and of course I'm bound always to talk about ESDC's full menu of labor market programming that's provided either through ESDC, through Service Canada, or of course through the provincial territorial transfers, which we do with the provinces and territories. Programs like apprenticeship, job grants, things like youth programming, disability programming, literacy essential skills, all of those programs, there's mainstream programs which go out through various different types of programming calls, call for proposals and so on, and application based. But more specifically, from the Indigenous perspective, we really like to tackle the human capital aspect, but we touch on the economic piece of it, and that's through 2 Indigenous programs that we have at ESDC. The current one, which we're just getting set to sunset, of course, is the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Program. And basically that's a program, $340 million a year through 85 agreements across the country, which we provide out to Indigenous communities for the delivery of employment and training. In exchange, we give that administrative flexibilities for a really robust reporting regime. And if anybody's been involved in assets, they know all about that reporting regime and the burden that that's caused on people over the last 10 years. Second piece, which is a little bit more related to the economic development piece, is the Skills Partnership Fund. And that's an ongoing program within ESDC on the Indigenous program side, and that's a $50 million a year partnership program. That's for small, medium-sized business. And the idea is that that's a matching program. So we like to have, it's a proposal-driven, call for proposal process where we look for partnerships between the private sector, small, medium-sized business sector, and Indigenous communities to roll out in various different areas of labor market training, skills development, and that's for new, existing, emerging initiatives that normally they wouldn't be able to fund under their general programming. That one's been very successful because, of course, it leveraged $250 million of additional investment across the country in partnership with Indigenous communities. It led to 87 projects across the country, and that call had gone out, and the funding for that is currently exhausted. But the key piece to that one is we'll be looking to do a new call in 2021. So as we start to reframe this over the next 8 to 12 months, we'll be looking for new priorities, we'll be looking for emerging opportunities, and also to how we can put a truth and reconciliation and devolution type context to that program as we move forward for a new set of projects in 2021. So that one will be rolling out in short order. Over the last 10 months, I've been out with my colleagues across the country, and what we've been doing is we've been trying to find a way to move forward to a successor post-Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Program. And the neat thing about that was in Budget 2018, of course, we had announced the new Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Program, where the Government of Canada announced a $2 billion program over 5 years with an additional $99.4 million per year additional funding over the first 5 years and ongoing money to this program. That's the first time in 20 years that we'd had an increase to our program, which was amazing. Also, the key aspect, and when we were out over the last 10 months, is the program's moved to distinctions-based framework. So no longer is it going to be about a pan-Indigenous program. It has a First Nations, has a Métis, has an Inuit, and then we also have a fourth, which is generally for organizations that we've dealt with that haven't been associated with those three. So 4 separate distinct base programming. The budget announced specific allocations and directed all the money to those 4 distinctive groups. So no longer are we in control of that pot, which was really transformative. The other aspect to it is we were able to move into the realm of 10-year contribution agreements. So no longer was it year-to-year, 5-year contribution agreements and this ongoing burden of not knowing what was going to happen. We've been able to sign or move forward to potentially sign 10-year agreements, which allow communities and Indigenous leadership to plan their human capital needs as we move forward. So what we've done over the last 10 months is we've been out around the country working with Indigenous leadership on developing 4 separate strategies, 4 separate terms and conditions, 4 separate programs that meet the needs of those specific groups. First Nations, know what's best for First Nations, Métis for Métis, Inuit, and so on. And looking at how best to roll out those programs come April 1st of 2019. One of the other key pieces to the program as we move forward is flexibilities, increased flexibilities. We've decided that it's time for us to get out of the way. Indigenous communities have been doing this for years and years and years. They know their communities, and we've taken a significant step back. We've looked at reducing reporting burden, allowing more flexibilities. We've included the framework of the programming to include a full menu of wraparound services. So whether that's more social issues, whether that's employment, training, education, childcare supports, whatever that may be, the Indigenous communities will have the ability to design their program framework to help overcome any kind of barriers they face on a human capital side. So that's been a significant change. The idea is that we need to close the gap. We need to close the gap in employment earnings continuum from mainstream to the Indigenous communities, but also we need to be able to help close the gap on a human capital side. We see it all the time when we're out talking across the country. We're talking to stakeholders, private sector stakeholders, and this is a key conference from a perspective of this is a new emerging economic opportunity. How can Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit participate in that, and how do we assist them to do that? And that's become very key. And rather than us tell or suggest how that happens, we've devolved that opportunity to Indigenous communities. So as organizations come in, they come and talk to us, they come and present to us, we say, come April 1st, the Indigenous communities have the money, they have the flexibility, they have the control over their programming and their human capital development, and we provide that linkage and that brokerage with the communities. We say to those organizations, it's time for you to talk to them right from the start, include them, and see how we can leverage that opportunity. So it's been a very transformative time. We have 85 to 100 agreements that will go forward come April 1st. So we have a lot of work to do with our Indigenous partners. It's been pretty painstaking from the aspect of, mostly it's been a big shift from government perspective on how do we get away from being controlling of everything and looking at devolving those tools, those investments, that control, so that organizations can be responsive. And, you know, from an ESDC perspective, that's how we support truth and reconciliation, build on our long-term partnership, and increase that respect to Indigenous communities as we move forward in helping close that gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. And just to paraphrase overall what we've heard here over the last several minutes were issues around the public policy, the licensing piece, So more the process of getting into the industry. Then we talked about the prosperity side of this, where Mohan talked about the supports that are there for the individuals in our communities, as well as the band enterprise approach and ways to increase the equity position and establishing a cannabis industry. And then we talked about the people piece, which really focuses on the human capacity and the programs that are there to enhance and to help build that aspect of our people, the constituents in our communities. Again, the one thing to mention here is that they did speak about the complexities of these, and what you heard here was pretty much a 3-point lockstep of various programs and policies that are there. Now, it's your turn, and we would ask that you come up to the mic, and if you have questions or comments with regard to each of these pieces, the licensing piece, the programs for economic development, and the human capital side of this, your questions, comments are really important at this point. Thank you. We have, if you can just make note of who you are and where you come from, we'd like that for the record. So please, we have the left-hand mic.
Morning. I'm Harvey Bell from Batchewana First Nation. And Isidore mentioned that copies of these presentations would be made available. And there is a lot of information there that we're going to get, or we've been getting so far this morning. Information that is vital that I would like to take back to my community. There's too much there to, unless you're a computer, to jot down. And so in regards to Dr. McKinney and the licensing portion, and whatever else is going to be coming out throughout this assembly, I would like to have a copy to bring back to my chief and council and to be able to share. I'll be with them next week, and I'd like to be able to present what has taken place. Miigwech.
Thank you, Harvey. And what we'll do is we'll make sure that those of you who want information before you leave here, we'll have that ready, and we'll establish the format for that by tomorrow. And if you want specific information immediately, then contact the back registration desk, and we'll make sure that you get that information. And also to note, we are generating a report, and how that report is going to go out is all the individuals that signed up here that have your contact information, we're going to get that report out to you specifically. But Bemadzwin is actually doing a report, and we're going to send that report to all the First Nations across the country. So this will reach your desk, and you will have that information that you request. So we got mic number 2 over on the right-hand side, please.
Yeah, so my name is Tim Barnhart. I'm from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, just near Desert-Mono, Ontario. So on Tyendinaga, like a lot of other nations, we have stepped ahead of the quay. I've been in business for 4 years now, dispensing cannabis medically, and there's a lot of other First Nations who have followed my lead and gone into this. And I've heard lots of talk on the stage about reconciliation. So what's reconciliation for sovereign nations and sovereign people when you're standing up there telling us how this is going to be done? Maybe reconciliation should have started 4 years ago when you guys started to create this act around us. So here we are today, so thank you. So where do we go as retailers, manufacturers, cultivators? Where do we go? Where do we stand in this government proposal?
So I'll take that one. Am I on? Yeah. Thank you. So obviously there's a lot of things going on the ground in Indigenous communities, but also elsewhere. You go through communities in many parts of British Columbia. There are also organizations there who've been operating in the cannabis space for some time. What we have tried to create with the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regs is a pathway for people who want to join the legal system to do that. And we've had a couple of things that have been put in place. I touched on the micro licenses as one example. The way we do our personnel security checks is another example. We've tried to make sure that that's flexible enough for those who want to come from the illegal market into the new system under the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regs, that there's room for that. And then with Indigenous communities, we've had a number of engagements across the country, community by community, trying to find pathways for those who want to join the legal system to do so. And it's almost in every community, the circumstance is a little different, and working through those opportunities has been quite an intensive exercise. But that's the kind of commitment that we have demonstrated through over 100 community visits and fairly intensive dialogue with a number of communities who've kind of come to us and said, how can we integrate what's happening on the ground with this new national system? And so I think that's where we've focused our efforts, is trying to create those paths.
Okay, is there any other commentary from the panel? Good.
No, maybe I can just add to that a little bit from a business support perspective. I understand there's concerns and about how the act was implemented and developed. Todd gave you a sense of the engagement that was done, and you know, certain decisions were made pursuant to that. I'd like to focus, I mean, my world is business support and business development. So, you know, I'd encourage people to think about what the opportunities are, right? And there is opportunity in the federal framework as it is today. I think there are other conversations to be had about the bigger picture on sovereignty and assertion of such. But I think there also is a conversation to be had about the existing framework and the opportunities that exist within that. And I think there are a lot of people in the audience that are keen on learning more about that. From a practical perspective, in terms of business support, I've laid out what we can offer for businesses that are interested in participating in the existing regime. You know, that currently is where there is some opportunity. So I'll leave it at that. I think there is a very valid and important conversation to be had that I think Health Canada is engaging in a number of communities. But I think it is a challenge for all of us when we talk about reconciliation. I often think of the two-row wampum, and not only what that means to government, but what that means to me as an individual and as a person that lives here. So what I can commit to do is try to move forward in partnership in the best way possible. And that's what I can do, and that's what I can commit to doing. But certainly I know there are concerns out there, and we're doing our best to address that.
Thank you. Is there any other commentary on that? You're good?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. No, actually, one of the things that we hear that same comment from an ESDC perspective over the last 10 months, going out and engaging First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. One of the things that we very often messaged was the fact that in this broader federal framework, we have a long ways to go. There's been steps taken, even from an ESDC perspective, while we have moved towards almost a full devolution. There definitely is a legislative, legal, there's all kinds of policy frameworks that have to advance. And absolutely, while those things are moving forward and those things, you know, are slowly being addressed, it can't be fast enough. But what we have to do is work within those frameworks that we have as a labor market program, for example, and see how can we advance that towards that ultimate goal absolutely the best way we can. And we take those steps and we move those steps. I know as an Indigenous person myself, one of the things that I look to do is move the yardsticks and continue to move forward and continue to push those boundaries and overcome those boundaries as a public servant, as a policy writer and a policy advisor, ultimately with that end goal. But absolutely, it's a long yardstick that we have to overcome, and we got a whole lot more work to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that commentary from the panel. And again, I want to just stress and note that the question that's being raised is one of jurisdiction. It's one of recognition of sovereignty. And, you know, I would be flat out wrong if I didn't acknowledge the importance of that. The reality that we're working with right here is a federal government that actually pushed this thing through very quickly. First Nations, because of the jurisdictional complexities, we were not afforded the opportunity to, you know, have our place within that. Just as an example, there should be set-asides. Right? There should be an actual space and recognition, a quantified piece of the pie, if you will. And then there's also, on the other side of that, you have First Nations that have actually went ahead through the federal process and actually had done all of the requirements for the licensing side of this. So, you know, there's actual an attempt by First Nations, and I would suggest that, you know, as a per capita contrast, I bet you First Nations have been working very hard at this and feeling as though these issues are falling on deaf ears because we weren't afforded the recognition at the front end of the process. And now this is something that the federal government is having to deal with. So the conference isn't trying to say we're for the federal process. We certainly are for the First Nations that are going through that pathway. But we also must recognize that the jurisdictional issues, the sovereignty issues, and the rights to stand on access to the industry, that's something that we must also identify in our final reports and say these are still outstanding issues and they have to be addressed. So I just want folks to know that. It's a very complex set of issues here, and it's one that we're going to try hard to identify and at least say these are still issues that need to be addressed. So let's go over to this mic here on the left-hand side, please.
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Tana Perry-Wilson from Tobic First Nation, CEO Operations, 10-year cancer survivor as well. I had a few questions. You talk about legal framework, legal. So back in 2012, the federal government was supposed to actually have put forth the Cannabis Act and legislation. So our communities went forward and created a Compassionate Use Act for which we operate our medical dispensary under. So we were raided back in 2016, in which we just finished our court case last Thursday. So Todd, what is Health Canada doing within your guys' framework to engage communities like mine and like my brother from Tinadega, who already have legislative pieces in place for which we're governing these dispensaries under? So we have regulations, we have bylaws, we have frameworks in place that we're already utilizing. So I'm wondering what Health Canada and what are the partners of Health Canada are doing to recognize what our frameworks are already in place. Is there going to be, like under INAC or ISC now, we have Aboriginal procurement set-asides? Is Health Canada looking at something with the licensing regimes to do Aboriginal set-asides? Also, you talked about these are legal frameworks. When we go through and we pass legislation, we do community consultation before these pieces are passed through our chief and counsel. So when you say come to the legal framework, we've already developed the legal framework within our own jurisdiction. So Chief Isidore, you're bang on when you say that it's a complex set of issues, but I'd like to know what steps are being taken because this legislation, it's 2019. You guys were supposed to put this forward in 2012. So that's been a lot of years. You guys could have come out and engaged our communities for this. So I think that was the end of my question. Oh, the hemp as well. So you put that under the Cannabis Act. Was there any consultation back to any of the regions to include that or include us into those new regulations you put into the Cannabis Act?
So again, we'll turn it over to Todd. What steps are being taken and what has been done with regard to consultation on hemp?
Right. So on your first question, I think your biggest question, what are we doing to kind of integrate existing legal frameworks that have been developed within communities? So I talked briefly about that in my answer to an earlier question. So we are meeting with a number of communities across the country who've put in place legislation, bylaws, whatever form it takes, to try and understand the policy objectives that are embedded within those legal frameworks and how those align with the ones that are in the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regs, and how we can work together towards those mutual policy objectives. I know that's a bit of a general answer, but we have done that in a number of specific communities across the country where and have invested fairly significant time and effort in trying to kind of reconcile those two frameworks in a way where both policy objectives can be served. So I don't think that has happened in Tobique, but we would be open to a conversation if the community would like to engage. On hemp, so the policy process that was used to develop the Cannabis Act and then the cannabis regulations and the industrial hemp regulations, I mean, there were specific consultations that happened during the task force on legalization and regulation. In the development of the cannabis regulations and in the industrial hemp regulations, there were consultations across the country. I didn't run those, so I can't tell you specifically of what outreach was done around the industrial hemp components of those, but in many ways the changes that were made to the industrial hemp framework were really kind of broadening and making it easier to use more of the plant. So the changes were fairly minor in terms of those regulations. They largely carried forward from what's been in place for about 10, 15 years. And then I think your other question was around set-asides. So there are no set-asides in the licensing program right now, and that's for a fairly simple reason, which is there's no quota on licenses. There's no limit to how many licenses we plan to issue under the Cannabis Act and cannabis regs. It's really what the market is gonna need, and we've set up a licensing process to try and accelerate the pace at which we put out licenses from whichever proponents come in. And there's no limit. There's no sort of, you know, once we hit 100 tons of capacity, we're gonna stop licensing. So in that context, the sort of idea of a set-aside doesn't quite align.
Thank you, Todd. And again, I want to just highlight that a little bit, because at the front end, you say from a quantified perspective, there is no set-asides. However, like, you know, setting aside, you know, some special considerations for First Nations walking through where there may be flexibility required. I think the set-asides that we're probably talking about are ensuring that there's a much more facilitated process to ensure that First Nation communities are able to access the industry. And I think what I'm hearing, again, I guess the encouraging piece about processes to recognize community laws, bylaws, and regulations. Obviously, that's something that we'll note in the conference record, that, you know, we should start to really find out exactly what those opportunities are, because a lot of communities, they just saw that just like the logging trucks going by with all the timber, we often get that stuck in that mentality that, you know, the train has already left the station. And I just want to note as well too that we've been already cautioned that, you know, this whole issue of production and supply, you know, the economies of scale and the international landscape is such that, you know, that the price of cannabis is going a lot lower and lower, and you know, the actual time to get into the industry, you know, is long gone. from that perspective. And we need to look at the ancillary side of this, and maybe this is where the discussion should take place. Where are those open doors and opportunities for the ancillary side? The testing, the value chain is a very important discussion in this, and this is where we should probably open up more of a focused discussion around what those actual opportunities are, because it's not just the production side of the cannabis industry. So again, a very good question, and Tobik, and you're opening up that dialogue around recognition of community licensing and that the regime at the community level. Those are very important discussions. So thank you for that question, and thank you for the response. Mic number 2.
Marcy Cho. Net in Marcy de CRSE, Sizi Titonat in Equi, Sizi Julia. Aware, Bawillish chats in Dennisly. John ni yasi den belyast hio. Hot oli don't that in estasi, huh? So what I'm going to do is translate what I said in Dene, because this is one of the points that I want to make to the federal government again. My name is Nolene Vilbrin in English. In Dene, I'm called Tsanot Inat Ekwi, which is Yellowknife's woman. And I was given that name in 2005 at an international Dene gathering. Since then, I've taken my role and my name and title of clan mother very seriously, because I've been given that responsibility by different tribes in Canada. My point is, when you talk about policies and legislation, the one factor that we're forgetting is the medicine that you're talking about, as if, you know, it's a product or a resource on the stock market. The one thing I need to remind everybody in this conference and the federal government, the employees that are contracted for this certain project, our ancestors, my uncle grew marijuana. I did not know until the late 70s. And I said to him, Uncle, if the RCMP find out that you're growing this, they will come and they will charge you. He said to me, why would they? I don't talk about my medicines. It is medicine from the land. We have all kinds of medicines and plants that existed before this Canadian government came into being, which is a corporation under the United States. And we know the history, how they outlawed the plants because they could not control the plants. And why? Because the plants are sovereign to our lands. So who has control over these plants? Are the clan mothers? Are the traditional healers? And I do not hear any dialogue about the plant and the relationship. Tim mentioned reconciliation. This government spent millions of dollars. I testified in almost every process that this government put out in policies. So for the guy that's doing the policies, I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully, because our plants cannot be controlled. Our plants grow out on the land. And I hear a lot of talk about making money. In my language, we were taught we cannot profit from our medicines. We know that. But today, we are allowing it. We allow it through ceremony. And we're forgetting that. So I'm here to remind the people that the plant that you're talking about and you want to legislate is our medicines. It is healing people. How are you going to help our people with policies that you're going to create that's going to be a barrier to our medicines? Because remember, the government said reconciliation. That includes reconciling our people back to the medicines. That's what I see. But what I hear is almost like our plants are being put on the stock market. If that's the case, I know investors, I know tribes that own their own banks and are willing to invest with other tribes that are willing to look at this medicine, as a healing plant. We know people, investors right now that are willing to put together a healing lodge with all of these medicines. How is the federal government and Indian Affairs going to open the doors for that when there are barriers? Where I come from, the Northwest Territories, there are 5 diamond mines, and yet the government shut down every healing lodge because they're building a new hospital. So we're seeing a lot of these inequities and these imbalances right now. So I'm asking the panel up there, how do you propose to get around these barriers when our voices in every other issue, whether it's the 60s and 70s scoop, whether it's residential school, whether it's the hospitalization, the sterilization? My family, and as well as every tribal family in Canada, survived your policies, and now I still hear more policies coming out. So my recommendation is that this process be brought back to the people in the communities. We don't need alcohol. We don't need those meths in our community. We need these plants. The Creator put these plants here for a reason. For every illness, there is a plant. We need to remind ourselves. So with that, I want to say Marcy Cho for allowing me to say what I need to say, because there are many, many women and clan mothers and traditional healers that are not here. Their voices need to be heard in this process, because those plants are there for the people. It's not there for industry, because industry has no heart. We know that. Look what's happening across Canada. There's no reconciliation. I don't see it. I see all but protests. So thank you. Marcy Cho. Sitsiat Marcy.
Miigwech, I just want to just say more of a commentary rather than a question, but the one issue that did get identified by the clan mother was getting this back to the communities and figuring out a way to get around the barriers. And I think that's, I'm hearing from the federal government that the federal government recognizes that has to happen, and I don't think that there are or should not be barriers to actually getting this back to the community. And I just want to note to the federal government that's a lot of the heavy lifting after the train has left the station that we're having to do. So again, I want to thank the elder for the commentary. I also want to note that we've got approximately 12 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask that you actually make your commentary, your question at this mic first. Very quickly, we'll go through the 4 questions and comments, and I'm going to document them, and then we're going to send it back to the panel. So I think we'll go over to Mr. Greg Padullo on the left mic.
Thank you. Generation 7 and Green Top Hemp Farm. I have a question specific to the restricted cultivars for hemp. Do you know if they're being updated? And if so, can you give us some specifics?
So the cultivars are generally updated once a year. That process is underway right now. From what I've seen, there's only one new cultivar that's being added. We're looking at whether we can do something extra this year, given the interest in high CBD hemp varieties. The one variety that it's coming to be added to the approved cultivars is not a high CBD variety. So that list won't contain any kind of Easter eggs that you might be looking for, but we recognize that there's going to be a demand to add those high CBD cultivars sooner than later, and we're trying to find a way to accommodate that within the process to approve new hemp cultivars.
Time's running out.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for that question. Mic number 2.
Hello, Justin Valmont with Think Tank Automation. My question is for Todd Cain. I'm wondering why Health Canada is no longer issuing readiness letters for licensed producers. It's making it more difficult for the smaller businesses who don't have access to unlimited capital. Thank you.
I think the short answer there is we are. Just the pace has slowed down as we did all the transition work post-October 17th. That we continuously look at our licensing process, but in the last couple of weeks we've issued 4 or 5 new readiness letters. So not the pace I would like, but we continue to do them, subject to any changes we make to the licensing process. That is still a step.
Thank you. Mic number 1.
Good everyone. I'm Pete Bernard from the Algonquins of Big-Wampanoag First Nation. Welcome to Algonquin territory. My question for the panel is, the Supreme Court gave you the ruling that you had a duty to consult, and you rammed everything through very quickly. There was no consultation. It's just, let's just get this out, let's commercialize it, let's make a lot of money and then deal with the Native people later. So when you're talking about policies and procedures, I don't think this generation is going to go for that. We are your solution, everybody in this room, the ECDEV officers, the counselors that are here, the chiefs, especially the dispensaries. What you have to acknowledge is that we do what we do very well. Our product is better, our product is safer, and you should be funding us to help fix a problem that you created.
That's a question and commentary from the panel.
Well, I mean, the law as we've got it in place, as I said in my commentary, we've tried to create the path for people to come in and fit within and integrate existing on-the-ground situations with that legal framework. And that's where we focused a lot of our energy, is trying to integrate. I can't really speak to the Supreme Court standard for consultations and whether that's been met. There was a good faith effort made during the task force. There was consultations that happened during the legislative process and during the regulatory process. And we all have our views on what that meant. Clearly, the demand for engagement around all things cannabis is extremely high, and we acknowledge that, and that's why we've put a lot of effort into ongoing engagement over the last year and a half, and why we're here at events like this, to try to continue that dialogue and work through the issues as they exist today.
Thank you. I want to actually address that issue and what we're seeing being played out here. There obviously are issues of coming into the industry late in the game, and we're hearing that there are dispensaries and folks in our communities that have chosen not to wait. But the one element and the critical component of achieving licensing or recognition is at the community level. And unfortunately, the real issue is that if the federal government didn't work with our communities in a kind of more of a collective way, and in a way that demonstrated that there's a train coming and you need to get on that train, and if overall, there was not a national effort, but rather a one-off discussions. Obviously, the survival of the fittest would have it that those that understood, that had investors, that had the capital to get in on the game earlier on, are in the game. But that's not a fair approach with respect to the collective rights of Indigenous people across the country. And that's certainly not reconciliation. So what are we left with? I think that the issue to really observe here at I guess the point of getting to the space where we are recognized is there's still much community work that has to happen. And we're seeing a lot of communities, and I know Tainanega is one of them, right, where there's a lot of community level work that's happening. So it's not that those doors are closed. It's just that unfortunately we're getting in the game when all the high grade opportunities are gone. And we're going to be left to deal with the high risk level business decisions to say, is it worth our while to get in the business now? So unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with. But some of these dispensaries are saying, well, we're going ahead. And I would just state that, it's really the community level work and it's the leadership that have that final endorsed say as to what's going to be accepted in the community. That's really the challenge, and I am seeing right across even Ontario as many communities that are saying, we want to get in, but is it actually viable for us to get in at this point in time? And certainly from a banned enterprise perspective, banned enterprises are saying, hey, this is way too high risk, way too much front-end investment and a lack of return. So these are real business issues that need to be observed, and I just wanted to the speaker at the mic, again, I note that, it's community process right now where a lot of this is having to take place, and I just encourage the leaders that are here in the conference, embrace those people in the community that are trying to find a successful pathway forward into the industry. So again, those comments are well taken. So thank you. We'll go to the last two speakers. Mic number one.
Hello, my name is Jordan Brandt. I'm from Tyne-Nigamwalk Territory. I work at Legacy 420, a dispensary, medical cannabis dispensary located there. I have less of a question and more of a few general statements for the panel. I've studied the Cannabis Act extensively, both before it was released and after it was officially ratified. And I have drafted a 7-point document that kind of goes through some of the points that I feel the majority of Indigenous people in this room could identify with, and why we feel the Cannabis Act either wasn't developed with us in mind or without consultation. The first point being that Indigenous communities feel there's been a severe lack of government engagement, which, despite what several of the panel members have been saying, in which there's been consultations, me coming from Tyne-Nigamwalk Territory, arguably the epicenter of Indigenous cannabis in Ontario, I've heard directly from Chief and Counsel myself that it's difficult or impossible to get a meeting of any kind with the provincial or federal governments regarding cannabis. So that I find very interesting personally. Cannabis as an intoxicant obviously can clash with traditional values, and compounding this issue, there's been very little to no government support for Indigenous-focused educational materials on cannabis. In fact, one of the only times Indigenous communities are mentioned in the Cannabis Act is in regards to our ability to say no to having cannabis sales on territory. So to me, while I was reading those regulations, that indicated to me that the federal government's only position on cannabis in regards to Indigenous communities is that we prefer that we say no to not having it, so they don't have to deal with other legal ramifications, obviously. So that I find very disturbing as well, because when you're dealing with individual nations and treaty rights and various things, there's been so much in the Cannabis Act that has not taken those things into consideration. That's another point that is brought up in this document is the Cannabis Act directly conflicts with cannabis, or with certain treaties and certain treaty rights on individual First Nations. There's been no talk about bringing the Cannabis Act into compliance with these treaties or discussion that there is conflicts with these treaties. So that's another concern that I'm sure a lot of people here share today. And finally, being able to provide medical information, medicinal information about this plant, about this product, about how it helps and heals people is something that's extremely important to Indigenous communities, and one of the only factors I believe that many communities are even considering having cannabis in their communities, and which obviously Cannabis Act completely makes that process illegal, where it's illegal to inform people about the medicinal benefits of this plant, and which, if a community was to follow those rules to the letter, I don't feel many communities in this in Canada would support having dispensaries on their land, because we do see it mainly as medicine, and marketing and selling it and informing people of such is a key component to that, and that's something that I feel that was severely overlooked, despite the fact that there's been supposed consultations. So just maybe the panel members want to speak to a few of those points, maybe not, but I feel that those few points are points that the majority of Indigenous people in this room can agree with there.
Thank you. And in light of time, what I'll do is I'll just defer that back to. I'd like to get a copy of the 7 points. I think they're really well placed in your commentary. And again, lack of engagement, cannabis clashing with traditional values, Cannabis Act clashing with the treaty rights, Indigenous rights, and medicinal education. So obviously these are things that are valuable in the current dialogue. So again, we'll get a copy of those, and we'll make sure that they become part of the report. Okay, thank you very much. We have mic number 2, and then that'll be our final commentary, and then I'll just wrap this up quick because we have the consortium on deck. So Max Ireland.
My name is Max Ireland. That's my government name. I'm from Oneida First Nation, and there's been a lot of talk today of laws, this, that. I'm interested in becoming a retail owner myself. So what is Canada going to do since you put this act out as a blanket? I see it as a blanket act. It covers everything. It covers everybody, when it shouldn't. That's been noted here today. So I don't want to put anybody else in my position. I'm going to do it myself. If I open a shop and I claim sovereignty and I don't want to deal with you because I don't want to deal with you, that's my right, I feel. What is going to happen to me, my family, my workers? Are you going to come in with the RCMP or the OPPs and confiscate everything because I don't fall within your parameters of your blanket act? Because we have a number of operations that are existing presently, and then probably a number of more that's going to come up in the near future. So when we venture into business or we venture into things, all of a sudden the government doesn't agree with us. Oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. When we've been denied funding responsibilities to our own families because of government regulations. This time, that shit's got to stop. No, you wouldn't want that for you, your family, but you continuously do it to us through legalese. I want to know what's going to happen. Am I going to be, is my situation going to be broken into, my product taken, my establishment damaged? Is that what I can look forward to? Yeah, what go?
Thank you. Thank you for that. And again, it's a pretty straightforward question, and I'll just ask Todd to answer that, and we'll conclude the panel. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, Max, I missed your last name, but you're right. It is an act. The Cannabis Act is an act of general application across the country. As I've said a number of times, we've put our energy not into law enforcement or anything kind of down that road. We've put our energy into dialogue, community by community. How do we reconcile what's happening on the ground, legal actions that a First Nation may have taken with the Cannabis Act and the cannabis regs? That's where we've put all of our energy. We've put lots of time. We've put hundreds of thousands of kilometers on the road going to visit communities, and that's where we continue to focus our energy today, is trying to find a path for the interests that are represented in this room to coexist with the Cannabis Act and that legal framework that you started your question off with.
Mohan?
Just a small comment. I think my colleague Todd needs to wear some asbestos pants because he's been taking a lot of the heat, so I thought I'd just make a few comments to address this very, very important question of Section 35 rights. The federal government, as you well know, and we heard the mention of the Supreme Court, in some instances has got it right, in some instances has got it very wrong. Our department, I represent Indigenous Services, but I also work with Crown Indigenous Relations, is undertaking rights and reconciliation discussions across the country with hundreds of communities. And there are a number of areas, where dialogue needs to happen to achieve the tough work of reconciliation. So again, we're channeling a lot of our energy towards those broader discussions across the country on rights and how we move together into the future to reconcile. And it's tough. It's tough work, and we've heard some very tough questions and extremely valid questions. And so again, we need to look for ways to engage and at the same time realize the opportunities that are in front of us today, I think. And so we can do that hopefully in parallel. Look at what the opportunities are today in the current framework, but as well there's opportunities for dialogue with Health Canada, specifically on cannabis, or with Crown Indigenous Relations on a whole host of issues where there are concerns about Section 35, whether it be environmental assessment, forestry, fisheries, other economic activities, territorial assertions and claims. So those dialogues will continue. There is space for that. But I hope over the course of the next few days, we will also look at some of the immediate opportunities that are in front of us and try to realize some of those benefits today and in the future. Miigwech, masicho.
Thank you, Mohan. Any final comments, Gerald? No? Okay, so with that, we heard about the process of licensing. We heard about the prosperity, the business development side of this, and Indigenous services, and the human capacity side. But note that much of the questions that came from the floor were about jurisdiction. And again, there's no more time for questions. We got people waiting at the mic, Chief. But if you just want to make a quick point or comment at the mic, just to register it. I was always told that the chief is always right. So,
Chief Wayne McKenzie from Temiskaming First Nation, Algonquin, Anishinaabe. I just wanted to make sure that the federals are talking to the real Anishinaabe that have the real rights, not these self-proclaimed groups. The greater of Algonquin people that's been around for maybe a couple hundred years rather than like 7,000 years. make sure that you talk to the right groups and give the right rights to the right people who, who's been through so much to get so little. So I just wanted to make sure that you talk to the right groups, and make sure that you identify who they are, where they are, how long they've been around. And like Algonquins of Ontario is not, they're self-proclaimed. There's another group around Montreal that's claiming is some kind of status as well. I'm just saying, just keep your, do your due diligence on the original peoples. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief, and thank the panel for your efforts. Thank you.